Welcome everybody to the environmentally conscious capital of the Kootenays. The city of Nelson prides itself on numerous progressive moves on issues that you will be considering today and tomorrow. Our small mountain community, for example, has for 20 years had a sophisticated sewage treatment plant. And if that sounds mundane, let me warn you, most pollution solutions are relatively mundane. The capital of British Columbia, meanwhile, by contrast, today flushes its toilets right into the ocean. The dried night soil in Nelson, I hope you've made your contribution while you're here, will fertilize our civic gardens. And that's the stuff of changing the world. While recycling is now becoming in vogue across British Columbia, Nelson ran a recycling program in 1971 and 72. I had the opportunity of being involved for a while, along with the gentleman at the table over there of the Kootenay Centre for a Sustainable Future, a table of information and expertise I can highly recommend to you. Initiated with federal make-work money in the early 70s, Nelson's recycling project ended with its funding, but it showed viability a decade or two before its time. As you explore issues today and tomorrow, you may well find that solutions to environmental problems are not often easy. Virtually all solutions will cost money. Many solutions, in fact, cause unforeseen adverse effects elsewhere. And many solutions cause dramatic economic and social dislocation. In short, good intentions are not enough. And I can tell you in politics that that's true, because if it were that easy, I can tell you that I'm personally environmentally conscious, and I believe our city council is, to solve all problems. But good intentions are not enough. An only slightly cynical look at history can lead us to conclude that, in fact, good intentions alone can lead to strife and war. What we do need to solve environmental problems is more events such as this. We need in our society to develop deeper understanding of the complex issues we face. And we must generate the broadest social commitment to act and to pay the necessary prices for acting. In this effort and in this conference, the people of Nelson join with you and wish you well. Welcome to our community, which we hope you will have a little time to explore and enjoy between your working sessions. Good morning.
Thank you, Your Worship. And now to bring you greetings from School District Number 7, Trustee and Vice Chairman Bob Cunningam.
Thank you. Lots of power there. Thank you, Bill. I hope our ecology is on a better base than that. Good morning, everyone. It is very encouraging to see the stands filled again with people ready to go. The Board of School Trustees of School District 7 and the administration and all others involved in the planning of this conference wish you the very best in your endeavors to help resolve these problems. And these problems are coming about very quickly. And I would just like to take a moment to point out how quickly things are happening. And I'll use as a comparison my own experiences, and as anyone can see, I'm still quite a young person. But when I started in the truck logging business in 1940, we would haul 3, sometimes 5, and a maximum of 6 logs on a load. We thought we were still doing quite well when 12, 14, 16 logs made up a load. And we got by quite nicely when the range ran from 20 to 24 logs. Before I left in 1983, 80 and 90 logs on a load. That is an indication of how quickly we are using up our resources. I don't believe that you will be able to go and change the direction of top administration of people in their 50s and 60s. You may have some influence on the people in administrative positions in their 40s and 50s. But very clearly to me, it is the young people who have to start fresh, and I hope we have the time to do it. In any case, we must be positive, we must believe that we can do it, and we must get on with the job. Thank you very much.
It puts our environmental dilemma in a nutshell in Vancouver Sun. Advertising mail makes up slightly more than 35% of Canada Post's volume and about 10% of its revenue. Most of it, as you know, as I do, it arrives at my house. It's unwanted waste paper. And taxpayers are footing the bill for its disposal. On the other hand, soliciting business by mail must pay off for the companies that use this method of advertising, otherwise they wouldn't do it. But you and I as consumers shouldn't have to pay the cost of that. But we do. We pay through taxes to get rid of this stuff, and we also pay an environmental cost. Perhaps there is a way to make them pay attention. This is the kind of thing we're going to have to think about over this weekend. We can send it postage-free if the bundle is less than 2 centimeters thick to the Environment Minister Lucien Bouchard, Parliament Buildings, Ottawa, K1A0H3. And it won't cost us anything, and it'll perhaps make them start thinking about it if we add a note demanding government take steps to protect the privacy of your mailbox and the environment at the same time. These are the kinds of things that might have an effect. All of those pieces of junk mail are printed on paper that comes from trees. It's not recycled paper. And as you know, as you drive through BC, you can see the places where that paper has come from on the hillsides. Monte Hummel calls them endangered spaces. That's just one of the kinds of areas that he'll be talking to you about this morning. Monte Hummel is the president of World Wildlife Fund Canada. He also serves on the boards of 12 other conservation organizations in Canada, including the Canadian Coalition on Acid Rain, the Canadian Council on Ecological Areas, and the Arctic International Wildlife Range Society. He is a former founder and the executive director and chairman of Pollution Probe in Ontario. For 8 years, he coordinated the undergraduate program in environmental studies at the U of T. He's written several books and authored over 100 popular and scientific articles on subjects relating to the Canadian environment. The World Wildlife Fund is the world's largest conservation organization. It has raised $500 million for 5,000 projects in 130 countries, and the international president is Prince Philip. We are more than pleased to be able to welcome, and you to welcome, Monte Hummel.
Well, I do a lot of public speaking, and every time I hear myself introduced, I can hardly wait to hear myself. It's a very flattering introduction, and I'd like to thank you, Norris, for reading it exactly as I wrote it for you. It's nice to be back in a high school gym, and to give you an idea of how I feel being here, and maybe the situation we're all in, I'd like you to consider a little story about a mother who was having difficulty waking her son in the morning. And her son pulled the covers back up over his head and peeked out and said, "I am not going to school. In fact, I'm not ever going to school again." And his mother said, "What's the matter? Are you sick?" "No, I'm just sick of school. They hate me. They call me names. They make fun of me. So why should I go?" And his mother said, "Well, I'll give you 2 good reasons. Number 1, you're 42 years old. And number 2, you're the principal." Well, there's a little moral to the story, of course. I think that none of us can hide under the covers any longer. We've got to face reality. We've got to face the reality of problems facing us. And I think that by choosing to attend this conference, everyone in this room has indicated that you're prepared to face the environmental problems that are facing us, and more important, that you, as teachers and students, want to try to do something about those problems. Whether you know it or not, I think that by being here, you've joined what John Fraser, the Speaker of the House of Commons in Ottawa, has called a worldwide conspiracy to try to save the world. And that's why I chose my rather grand topic of how to save the world. Before I go any further, though, I'd like to declare my own point of view, my biases, my prejudices, if you want, because I think you should know that above all, I speak as an activist, and this is how activists dress these days. My background with Pollution Probe was alluded to. Our motto in the early days was "Sue the bastards." Things have changed a bit, but being an activist means that I judge people by what they do, not by what they say. It means that I like to see results. Being an activist also means that I'm pretty impatient. In fact, after 8 years of coordinating the undergraduate program in environmental studies at the University of Toronto, I quit a very secure job because I felt that that institution was a little long on talk and short on action. I got impatient. In a nutshell, I guess I believe that nothing really happens until somebody does something. Therefore, if we're going to do something, if we're going to save the world, we have to stop wringing our hands and analyzing and worrying about the world situation and get on with doing something about it. But obviously, before we run around busily doing things, we have to know what we're doing. And I think in 1972, a group called the Club of Rome said it all. Through a team at the Massachusetts Institute for Technology under the leadership of Dr. Dennis Meadows, they published a landmark book called The Limits to Growth. This was the book I built my coursework around at the University of Toronto. And it identified a number of global forces which were responsible for what Meadows and the Club of Rome called the predicament of mankind. The 2 key forces were human population growth and industrial growth. The 2 key results of these 2 driving global forces, the 2 key results, were global pollution and resource depletion. And under resource depletion, they included things such as decreases in minerals, non-renewable resources, arable land, fossil fuels, and food production. And using computer modeling, Dr. Meadows really asked a fairly simple question. He asked, what will happen if present trends in each one of these factors continue? The answer was, having fiddled with it this way and that way and modeled it, these global factors, the answer was global collapse. Meadows then asked what I think is a much more important question, a more constructive one, namely, what changes have to occur to avoid global collapse? And to save you a lot of reading, the answer was that those two driving forces, human population growth and industrial growth, must be stabilized or nothing else matters. We can't save the world without stabilizing those two factors. Now, since 1972, there were many critiques put out about the Club of Rome study, none of which knocked it down. And there have been many, many more global reports on the world environment published since. Some of them are quoted and alluded to in your program. And sure, we've become much more sophisticated in identifying problems, and we've even added a few new global forces, such as global warming and species extinction, some new ones to Meadows' list. But in my view, these reports are all variations on the same theme. Simply stated, either we change the way we're doing things on this planet, or we will perish, and we will take a lot of other living passengers with us. Not all of them. Some of them will persist to have a look at what we've left around and might have the last laugh, but it's not a very cheery future for our particular species. Well, is any of this gloomy news relevant to Canada? The answer, unfortunately, is yes. Canada, after all, is part of a larger global ecological system. Therefore, what happens elsewhere in the world affects us, and it's important to note that what we do here affects others. And yes, Dennis Meadows' global trends are alive and kicking right here at home. For example, species extinction. Already, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada has listed 183 wildlife species. Loss of ecosystems, mention was made of endangered spaces. We're quickly eliminating our own rainforest by converting coastal old-growth stands in BC to commercial plantations. And we've already lost the East Coast old-growth forests. The tall grass prairie, which once brushed the stirrups of pioneers and sort of disappeared on the horizon, is now the largest representation of that endangered space is 10 hectares within the city limits of Winnipeg. Pollution? Well, acid rain threatens over 40,000 lakes in Ontario. Toxic wastes infest the Fraser Delta, sort of going from west to east. The Fraser Delta, our prairie sloughs. We've done a lot of work on pesticide residues in prairie sloughs. The Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence River, certainly the most polluted river basin in Canada and one of the most polluted in the world, which accounts for the plight of those 350 or 400 beluga whales that are bravely trying to hang on there. And we have serious toxic levels in our Atlantic harbors as well. Well, what about resource depletion? Surely Canada is a resource-rich country, but listen to the current debate about wood supply for the forest industry in Canada. And of course to Senator Sparrow last night when he talked about soil degradation in this country. It's not just blowing around in the Sahel and in Africa. Population growth. Well, here's an interesting one for Canada, because surely if there ever was an example of an underpopulated country, it would be Canada. But in fact, Canadians are concentrated in cities, even more so than Americans. A larger proportion of our population lives in cities than the US population. And in fact, Canadians live along a very narrow band of arable land in the extreme southern portion of our country. Again, Senator Sparrow was giving the numbers last night. 7% of the country being arable land. In other words, we're crowded into a relatively small space, or we've chosen to crowd ourselves into a relatively small space, and in light of that, we might ask, are we indeed such an underpopulated country? Well, the point of all this is not to give you a gloomy list or inventory of ecological horrors. In fact, I hate speakers that do that. It's simply to indicate to you that Canada is not immune to exactly the same kind of forces that Dennis Meadows and the Club of Rome identified nearly 20 years ago in the Limits to Growth study. Okay, I think that most of you are sold that we've got problems. We don't have to state them over and over again. What are we supposed to do about all this? Well, I would suggest, in a rather simplified way, a 3-step action program for each of us. And to summarize it in advance, speak up through the marketplace, speak up through the ballot box, and speak up through others. Number one, speak up through the marketplace by changing your consumer and household patterns. Yes, I'm afraid this to reflect a concern for the environment, and it includes trying to thread your way and choose amongst those so-called environment-friendly products. It means recycling and recovering and reusing containers. Nice touch that the speakers were provided with a coffee mug, which we can use over and over again in the course of the meeting. Nice touch that there's going to be an effort made anyway to recycle those plastic cups from the punch party. Really nice to hear one of your city officials talking about being leaned on to turn the water off while she's brushing her teeth. So these are all little things, but they're little things that you can do. Our biggest polluter by far is the automobile. We've got to make an effort to drive less and to use more fuel-efficient cars. I know you've heard all of this before, and it really reflects a whole bunch of things, a whole long list of personal lifestyle changes that grassroots environmental groups are promoting right across Canada. And if it's all getting boring or starting to bear on people's consciences, then I'd suggest why not just start doing it. After all, it doesn't really make sense to say that we're concerned about the environment if we're not prepared to make these personal changes. And nobody's going to be alone because there's lots of people doing it. Furthermore, I believe that a major shift is occurring in consumer products. It's a controversial one, but I think it's driven by consumer demand and concern for the environment, and I, for one thing, it's just great that business is starting to compete on the basis of who can make the most environmentally sound products rather than who can make the most irresponsible ones. So that's what I mean by speaking up in the marketplace. Number two, speak up through the ballot box. And I realize that some of you maybe can't vote yet, but you can still insist that the only politician who gets your moral support is one who's committed to the environment. You might even consider going after and leaning on those who aren't. And in this regard, I think we have to learn to be much tougher and much more specific with politicians. And I'm not an anti-politician person. In fact, a great deal of my time is spent lobbying and trying to charm and persuade politicians to do things. And some of them are extremely devoted and dedicated and very helpful. But we can't allow them to wrap themselves in this cloak of green rhetoric while they're really not doing anything very meaningful for the environment. There's a lot of talk floating around right now, but I think when all is said and done, more is said than done. And if we're going to ask tough, specific questions, it requires hard work and homework. There's really no other way around it. Right now, I think that society is much too lazy about this. We've got to educate ourselves sufficiently, for example, to ask a politician not just to make some loose, nice-sounding commitment to clean up the air, but we have to put a specific proposal before politicians asking for reductions of emissions by so many kilograms per unit area by such a date, and if those targets aren't met, then very specified penalties will be laid down. In the trade, it's called targets and timetables. It sounds technical and dry maybe, but I have a friend, Adele Hurley, who's the executive director of the Canadian Coalition on Acid Rain. She says, every time I hear an announcement about a politician regarding air quality, I ask myself, if I was a fish, do I feel better? It's a very good question. Ask yourself, if I was a fish, do I feel better? What specifically is going to come out of the air or the water to improve the environment as a result of this? What measurable difference is this announcement going to make? And if we don't do this, if we don't get specific and tough, politicians are going to continue to get away with murder when it comes to our planet. And we will be letting them murder it. We will be complicit for having let them do it. So I think we have to formulate precise, tough questions that require clear yes or no answers with no wiggle room, no squirming off the hook. So that's what I mean by speaking up at the ballot box. Third, my little three-point program, speak up with others. Because some environmental issues are just too big, obviously, for you alone to try to tackle. You can do your part, but there's some things you've got to do in conjunction with others. And again, this takes homework. A little research on what groups are active in your area, what they stand for, and how you can get involved. The important thing, at least to me, is that you get involved with the group of your choice. Not which group, but that you get involved with the group. And I thought that Jeff Gibbs' proposal last night, the Alliance for Youth, is one that's really seriously worth considering. Through organized efforts and joint actions, you can tackle some of those bigger national and international problems identified by Dennis Meadows. I'd like to close my remarks by offering some thoughts about the role of environmental education in all this, because I think I have some somewhat unconventional views in this area, and I'm afraid that my impatience and leanings as an activist really begin to show, because I can't stand the usual answers to this question. One answer, for example, and it's been alluded to a number of times already, is that the role of environmental education is to equip future generations, the leaders of tomorrow, you're often called, to cope with environmental problems which basically we are leaving behind, the current generation. This view really bugs me. Because to that I say, well, great, but what's the responsibility of this generation? We have power now. We can make changes now. But we're talking about turning the world over to a group that doesn't really have power yet. And I'm really not interested in avoiding responsibility for the mess we're in and that we've made by passing it on to future generations. This generation must change, and we must change now. We must lead and educate by example, and not by waiting for our children to do the right thing. It is this generation when you think about it, it's this generation which determines the future, not the next generation. You'll determine the future of your children. We are determining your future. You will inherit our actions, and right now our actions are limiting the choices that our children will have. So, I don't want to sound totally unsympathetic, but I am very sensitive to this future generations, leaders of tomorrow theory of environmental education. Another answer is that environmental education's role is to nourish a change in social attitudes, because this shift in ethics or change in values is necessary before people will really do anything to protect the environment. To this argument, again, I say fine, but have you checked the public opinion polls lately? Every major poll, Gallup, Crop, Decima, Environics, you name it, documents a tremendous shift already in Canadian public opinion. For example, 95% of Canadians approve of government expenditures for wilderness preservation. 93% say we shouldn't relax environmental laws to achieve economic growth. 88% say protecting the environment is more important than keeping prices down. 87% are upset about the lack of action taken to protect the environment. 70% say we should do more to protect the environment, even if it means jobs will be lost in the process. And 70% believe that, in fact, major spending on the environment will have a positive effect on the economy. These are astounding numbers. During the last federal election, the Prime Minister's office looked at some of these polling results and had the polls done again. And you know what happened? It went off the map even more when they did the polls over. These facts indicate that anyone waiting for a shift in values may have been passed in the backstretch. I don't want to overstate this, but we'd better be careful that the revolution hasn't happened while we weren't looking. The real problem is not, in my view, a transformation in the attitudes of Canadians. The problem is a tremendous mismatch in this country between public opinion and public policy on the environment. Canadians want something which they're not getting. So think twice before you spend a lot of time about changing attitudes that may have already changed. The third view of environmental education, which kind of crawls under my skin, is that its role is to develop technical expertise to carry out the necessary studies and analysis to properly understand environmental problems. Well, again, I say fine, okay. But be very careful that all this study and analysis hasn't already been done. At least sufficiently done for some very obvious action steps to be taken. We know, for example, what needs to be done to control acid rain. We know in detail what needs to be done. The problem is not an adequate technical understanding of the problem. The problem is getting the political commitment to do what we all already know needs to be done. So again, I caution you, be careful about spending too much time analyzing problems at the expense of doing something about them. Again, my background and leanings, I guess, as an activist come through. Okay, so those are all the things that I think environmental education is not. What is the role of environmental education, in my big fat opinion? Well, I believe it's to break down the barriers of cynicism and hopelessness. I believe your job as concerned teachers and students, and my job as an activist, is to help people believe that something can be done that will make a difference. With the first part of my talk, I've tried to argue that we already have taken a number of the first key steps towards saving the world. For example, we know there's a problem, thanks to Dennis Meadows, David Suzuki, and a number of other excellent spokespersons who are outlining the problems. Next, we care. Canadians care. The world is beginning to care. There's a greening of the globe going on in terms of public attitudes. And we want to do something about these problems, as indicated by public opinion polls. Two very important steps. Another step, we even have a pretty good idea of what needs to be done in many situations. And if you accept my little three-part personal action plan, of speaking up through the marketplace and the ballot box and through others, those are steps that we can take. The real need now, in my view, and the real danger, is that people will not link these first few steps with the most important ingredient of all, which is hope. Put simply, we must believe that we can save the world. And that is the role of environmental education. It must serve as a motivator. Otherwise, people are going to be left in the lurch, and I see this happening every day. They genuinely want to do something, but they're not finding an outlet for their concern. And in many cases, they don't think it's going to make a difference anyway. And that leads to frustration, to cynicism, and despair. And if frustration, cynicism, and despair set in, we've had it. You see, I believe we're at a very crucial crossroads. Environmentalists have never had so much going for us in terms of technical expertise and public support. In the language of Ottawa, we have a tremendous window of opportunity. It's taken 20 hard years of work, and many people have been at it longer than that, but it's taken at least 20 years of hard work to get to this point, and I think we could be on the verge, on the brink of some really major environmental breakthroughs. My message to you today is to hang in there, because this is exactly the wrong time to give up. Henry Ford said that if you believe you can do something, you're right. And he said, if you believe you can't do something, you're also right. I'm saying that above all, teachers and students must believe we can do something about our environmental problems. To paraphrase Mr. Ford, if we believe we can save the world, we're right. We can. So join me become an environmental activist. Thank you.
Now's a good time to stand up if you feel like it. And you can thank Mr. Hummel by asking him some questions if you wish. Mr. Hummel, would you field some questions for a few moments?
It's the use of fossil fuels in motor cars, in aircraft, all over the place. Where is the research and development to make use of the solar energy, which is there in abundance around the equatorial regions of the globe, to convert that into a form which can be stored and transported and used where it is needed to get away from the use of firewood by the native women in the native villages, which is decimating our few remaining trees, and to replace the seven sisters in the oil patch who don't appreciate interference with their vested interests.
You're going to be busy. Well, all I can say is good question. I was one of the founders of Energy Probe, and as far as I'm concerned, a guy named Amory Lovins is the patron saint of energy planning. He's been working on so-called soft energy paths and advising, believe it or not, the French cabinet and governments of the world on soft energy planning, which is really what you're talking about, getting off the so-called hard path of fossil fuels, hydrocarbons onto alternatives, and realizing that it's cheaper to save a watt than it is to generate a new one. I'm very concerned about what's happening in Canada right now. There have been drastic cuts to our own efforts and exploration of alternative energy, particularly solar, passive solar. I think the oil companies, to a certain extent, they sell a product which goes into an automobile, and the heat's got to be put on automobile manufacturers in terms of regulations to bring down our NOx, our NOx emissions. So I think that part of the problem is regulating and modifying our existing system and tightening down in terms of emissions. But in the long run, we have to get off the hard path, the hard energy kick. And I was hopeful for a while that sheer price was going to drive us to do that. The cost of oil in particular stimulated a lot of interest in insulating buildings and energy conservation strategies as opposed to burning more fossil fuels. It seems to me we've backed away from that, and I'm not very optimistic right now about what's happening with respect to energy planning. And Canada is considering a number of mega projects when it comes to energy, all of which have been exempted from environmental assessment. So it seems to me we're losing ground in that very fundamental area. There is work being done through the Bell Reeve Foundation on, you mentioned wood, alternatives to wood, particularly, we don't realize that the majority of people in the world still burn wood for energy, particularly in Africa, and that's having a major impact on habitats and deforestation and causing a lot of the famine problems because of poor land use. And people are experimenting with and utilizing alternative methane and alternative fueled stoves, but again, they haven't caught on in a major way. So I'm sort of stumbling around here just mentioning initiatives that I know of. They're all great things that have been started, but they don't seem to have really gotten off the ground and to be out-competing our established or conventional energy technologies. I think the greenhouse gases, the global warming effect, is stimulating a new interest in this problem, though.
So what would you suggest that we do to deal with and to cope with the enormous transnationals that hold the true power in the world and are making huge profits by polluting our environment and ravishing our countrysides?
Well, boy, I mean, he has to solve some pretty big problems. I think the answer to that one is not to do away with the transnationals and the profit motive and all that sort of stuff. I mean, that may happen someday, but if you're going to wait for that to happen before we can solve our environmental problems, good luck. I think you've got to make it unprofitable to continue polluting. And I think slowly but surely we're doing that. You have to make sure that it is just part of the rules of the game that when you operate on a multinational or a national basis, that you have to conduct your affairs, whether you're a government or a corporation, in a way that doesn't pollute or degrade the environment. And if you think about it, when Pollution Probe was founded 20 years ago, there wasn't a single environmental department or ministry in the country. There wasn't an Environmental Protection Act anywhere in the country. We now have departments, institutes, and laws in every jurisdiction of Canada, and international laws as well. So I think there is a trend towards regulating and making it unprofitable for business to continue polluting the environment, and certainly socially unacceptable. So I think that's the general answer. Sticks, carrots, jail terms when necessary, but business has to get the message that we mean business, and that it's now just a cost of business to conduct your affairs in a way that you don't run down the environment. There are many people, by the way, in business who believe that already. I am not a sort of carte blanche anti-business person. I believe there are good people everywhere now. After 20 years of involvement in this movement, 21 now I guess, through Pollution Probe alone, we've channeled and hired and turned loose on society about 650 people, and they are everywhere. They're in government, they're in corporations. I think there's good people everywhere, including in the corporate sector, so they have to be nourished and supported.
Just on this topic, I noticed a letter to the editor in the Globe and Mail yesterday by Dr. Jovan Jovanovic addressing this very thing. Is that what you were going to talk about? You had your hand up. Would you like to?
Not now, no.
No?
I was going to ask something else.
Well,
Perhaps related to it.
Well, go ahead and ask what you're going to ask.
Oh, thank you.
You had your hand up. Come on.
Is this
Over here. Just a moment.
I was going to ask to first comment that I like very much the comments that His Worship Mayor made this morning, and in particular that everything costs money and that good intentions are not enough. So what I would like to ask you is if you would like to comment on that and answer the following question. What fraction of gross national product should we, in Canada or in the world, devote to the protection of our environment, and how do we collect that money?
On the first one, I liked the Mayor's remarks too, particularly the business about a sewage treatment plant and how doing things about for the environment are pretty mundane sometimes. Up until about a year ago, the city of Montreal was dumping 300,000 gallons of raw sewage into the St. Lawrence River every day. Quebec City still has no sewage treatment, neither does Victoria. Halifax is just starting. These things sound terribly uninteresting and dull, talking about tax revenues and infrastructure and trunk sewer systems and stuff like that, but that is where the fight for the environment is often at, in those dull trenches and trying to find municipal revenues and funds for those kinds of programs. So if that's what you're alluding to about His Worship's remarks, I agree with you. As far as percentage of GNP is concerned, the answer is I don't know. I don't know what percent we should be looking at. I think that we do need monies out of tax revenues to do things for the environment, to spend on programs, cleanup programs, such as municipal treatment plants. I think we also, I would go back to what I said earlier, have to make sure that we aren't always doing things for the environment by pulling money out of tax revenue, and it's like an add-on approach to the environment. I think we have to make doing things for the environment part and parcel of everyday life. And it doesn't cost money out of the GNP to pass laws that say the point of impact for SO2 has to be so many kilograms per hectare or whatever. And I think that we have to regulate and build into our way of doing things every day compliance with concern and respect for the environment. That has to be a big part of the answer, as well as identifying major funds that are going to be spent on add-on kinds of programs.
I just want to make one announcement. For you people at the back, we now have a mic that can get to you. So if you have a question, put up your hand. And this gentleman right here, please stand up. Let them see you. If you have a question, we'll get to you, and you can ask it from...
I don't want to ask a question. I would like to make a comment about your statement. I think you're perpetuating a myth when you say, particularly an attitude myth, that the multinationals have the power. They don't have. And when you say that, all of us sort of sit here and say, yeah, he's right. You know, but when you stop and think about it, they don't have the power. We sitting here have the power. We have the choice of buying their product, writing them letters, standing on the street corner, whatever it is, and saying, I'm not going to buy your product. And if you do that en masse, you will see them jump. So please, when you hear speakers, just don't accept the things they say, because they may be mythology, which really isn't true. And I'm sorry, I don't want to pick on you, but that's sort of the myth that we don't have the power. We do have. We have to believe, as he says, we can do it, and to hell with them.
After that show we seen last night on the Amazon, I think that Canadians have accepted the fact that the Indian people in the Amazon jungles are doing a good job for the world. And I think what we're missing is that Canadians should be looking at their own forests and doing something about it.
Well, I'd sure like to comment on that, because I agree with you. My own organization has been involved in raising money for the tropical forest, the Amazon particularly, and I think just, in the last 2 years would probably just be under $2 million that we've raised from Canadians by selling deeds for acres, and that money is all doing good work in the Amazon right now. And a lot of the talk that the stuff that Jeff went over last night, but the Kayapo and Payakon, we've been directly involved in. It's interesting to me that Canadians are rallying around the Amazon and the tropical forest, and I think what we have to do is find an avenue and a route for them to be as concerned about Canadian ecosystem and Canadian native cultures, because we have as serious, if not more serious, problems right here in Canada. I could give you a whirlwind cross-country tour of endangered spaces, of habitats which we are losing, which are down to desperate last remnants. So that one of our goals through the Endangered Spaces campaign, which I'll be talking about later this afternoon, I didn't want to cover it in my talk this morning, is to do exactly what you're saying, is to channel some of that concern and interest into Canadian habitats. And we're doing it in cooperation with the Assembly of First Nations, which really represents all of the status Indians in Canada, with the Inuit Tekarisat, the major national Aboriginal organizations who have endorsed the campaign. So it's a very good point you've made, and it's one that we're trying to act on.
Apparently there are those who are now saying that the problem in Indonesia is even worse than in Brazil.
I would agree with that.
Actually, you've already talked about what I was just going to ask you about. My grade 8s last year raised, through your program, enough money to buy 7 acres of rainforest land.
Thank you.
And I'd love to go back and tell them exactly what you were proposing to do with that money, because they hear a lot about, we talk about it all the time, how the government of South America is unwilling to accept this money with respect to trade-offs. You're paying off the World Bank, I believe it is. I was just wondering if you could clarify and maybe say for them hey, you know, I know the leaders aren't going to accept this, but we're hoping it'll make a change. How are you working with that money?
Oh, I'd be delighted. I think probably that was the funds that we were raising for the Monteverde Reserve in Costa Rica. And there were 20,000 acres that were available to purchase, and through Canadian donations, we purchased all of them. The reserve is in the hands of a non-government organization, which is important in Costa Rica, not in the hands of the government, which can be a little volatile. And so it's in safe hands, and it's going to be perpetuated. We've bought the land. We've established a trust fund to match or to manage the land so that it's not going to be left in the lurch with no monies to manage it on an annual basis. To protect it, really, is what we mean by managing. We've entered into CETA with about a $600,000 contract to reforest the area surrounding the reserve, so we're now establishing a buffer area around the reserve to protect it. And we did a deal, a rather complicated one, with the Costa Rican government on what's called a debt swap, debt for nature swap, whereby we bought up some of the debt of Costa Rica and thereby allowed every $1 which Canadians had contributed to the campaign to have $4 worth of impact within the country of Costa Rica. I'm extremely proud of that campaign. Absolutely every dollar went just exactly where people wanted it to. Not only $1, but in fact you got $5 worth of impact. It's in safe hands, and that reserve is now protected, not only purchased but protected in perpetuity because there is a trust fund to manage it. So it's a very solid program. We're now turning our attention to the area that Jeff was talking about last night, which is the Amazon, and it's going to be more difficult because you're quite right. The government of Brazil is becoming quite sensitive to pressure from outside. They regard a lot of this conservation interest as meddling in their internal affairs with some justification. And it's going to be tougher to work on. But on that particular project that you're talking about, I assure you, every penny went where you wanted it to, and thanks very much for your support.
I have a comment about the role of the multinationals has been raised, whether they have power or not. I just like to observe that we seem to have an economy that's based on destruction of our hillsides, wherever. That's just the way it seems to work. We have a culture here. We export the values of that culture to places like Central America, where traditionally are not meat-eating countries, where the elite now insist upon meat themselves. Hence, a lot of the destruction of the rainforest there for the purpose of raising cattle so we can bring it back here and sell McDonald's and their own elite in that country. I say this because the issue to me seems to be a lot deeper than just looking for technological fixes in terms of what we can do out there. I mean, I think what's at stake is just our whole value system, the way we relate to each other. So I just raise this for other people to think about it. It's like a sea of collective psychism that we exist and swim in all the time. There's just so much we take for granted. And in that taken for granted, we perpetuate the values that have led to this destruction in the first place.
Well, I think I agree with you. I think we have had a society which has been based on destroying natural things. The rewards, the material rewards in society have gone to those who've done the best job of raping and pillaging the earth. And there's what Toffler called, I think, a third wave, now ricocheting and bouncing back through society. I'm not saying that it's all one, it's done, the revolution in values has happened. I'm saying it's happening, and I really believe this. I think that Canadians are very unhappy, fundamentally unhappy and uneasy about what we're doing to the environment. And they're saying so when they're, at least in their general malaise, and there is a shift of our values occurring. But my point was that I think they're trying to find an outlet for that change in values. I think that it's become politically unacceptable to have a position that's insensitive to the environment, and I think that's great. Environment is becoming mainstream thinking, and I think that's great. The leaders of the multinationals are at least mouthing the rhetoric of being concerned for the environment, and I think that's great. It's better to have them mouthing that rhetoric than anti-environment rhetoric. Our job is, the point of my talk is to take advantage of this third wave, these kernels, these seeds that are being sowed and that are being expressed by the Canadian public and by others in the world, that we've got to change. I'm not as gloomy as I used to be about that. The very fundamental shift that you're talking about, I think it's occurring, and it's occurring in the darndest places. So I'm hopeful about that. I think that change in values is necessary. I agree with you. I think it's happening, though. And we've got to glom onto it and nourish it and make it happen faster. I also agree that not only has our own society been hopelessly materialistic and anti-environment, I think that's changing, and I agree we've exported it. And I'm a forester by training, not exactly a conventional forester, but I am a forester by training. And I saw third world students being trained in the Faculty of Forestry, doing exactly what you're talking about, exporting our not only our techniques and our technology and our approach to temperate and coniferous forestry, industrial forestry, to the third world where it has dubious relevance, but our values, the underlying values, also being exported. And I think there's a sensitivity developing to that here, and there is certainly a sensitivity developing to it in the developing countries. They are finding it less and less acceptable to be simply transporting our culture and our technology into their environment. So I agree with everything you've said, but I might be a little more, I see trends, maybe I just optimistically glom onto trends which I think indicate that things are changing.
Yeah, I'd like you to comment on whether or not, I think we probably have a consensus here about the necessity for these changes. If you'd comment on the capability of the traditional political parties in Canada to respond to this public sentiment, or do we need a strong environmental third Green Party in Canada to achieve these goals?
Well, in my view, every one of the political parties, the established political parties are equally bad and good when it comes to the environment. I make absolutely no political distinction amongst them. I'm prepared to support anyone of any political stripe who'll do anything for the environment. And my experience has been that there are both pro and anti-environment people right across the political spectrum. So I don't think that anybody's got a corner on self-righteousness when it comes to the environment, when it comes to political parties, and I don't think that any is particularly more anti-environment than the other either. So I'll just duck the whole question of who's best in that way. But I'm telling you the truth. I really don't feel that any political party's got a corner on the environment. Some individuals within their parties are much stronger than others, and those are the kinds of people who have to be nourished and fostered and supported from the outside. My personal view is that the Green Party, I don't think that a fourth estate, we need a third wave. We need a fourth estate. We need a new way of thinking, for sure, sort of creating this shockwave through our existing political institutions. I'm not convinced that the best way to get that wave moving is to create yet another political party. If it has the effect of because I don't think that another political party has got a chance in hell of assuming political power. That's why, from realistic political strategy, remember, I'm interested in results, and I'm not interested in investing a lot of time and energy in a strategy that isn't, if that's the goal. If the goal is to have a third or fourth party which is going to put enough heat on the establishment parties that they have to incorporate a more serious approach to the environment into their programs, if you follow me, so that the parties that are in power are more environmentally sensitive, I guess we could consider that strategy. I happen to feel there are enough individuals, I emphasize individuals, within the existing political structure who are pro-environment, that our time should be spent supporting them and expanding their influence within the existing parties rather than creating a whole third or fourth political dynamic. But that's my own analysis of the Canadian political situation, and I'm very respectful of those who have a different view.
The videotapes are available from Shaw Cable. They can be ordered directly. It's right in your program, and you will be able to get them.
I think you've probably alluded to this indirectly already, but I think there's a wide-held view by perhaps politicians or boards of directors of various companies that environmentalists are still these nothing more than basic tree huggers, and there's that stigmatized view that still exists among a lot of higher echelon governors in our country. Can you comment on that statement and perhaps suggest ways of getting around this?
Well, again, I think things are changing. There's tremendous diversity within the environmental movement in Canada, which is a good thing, in my view. I guess we're a wildlife fund. We're seen as the guys with the shirts and ties who embark in conservation diplomacy, and quite frankly, our approach often is, do you want to deal with us or do you want to deal with them? And often them knows exactly what we're doing because we've talked in advance. So there's more collusion and cooperation goes on, I hope, than you may suspect. I think, my personal view is that I think it's unfortunate when environmentalists play into the stereotype of being sort of a totally crunchy granola, tree-hugging, undisciplined, doesn't do their homework, has no technical expertise kind of group. Now, don't get me wrong, the things that move me to be concerned about the environment, I'll just lay it on the line personally, are aesthetic. They're artistic and very spiritual. That's why I got involved in this game, and that's what keeps me going. I'm not a technocrat. I got my master's degree in philosophy, so. But when you're going to go talk to the chairman of the board and senior operating officers of major corporations in Canada, which I do quite often, or to cabinets, you can't, unfortunately, their values aren't at the spiritual aesthetic level. They want to hear some cold dollar arguments from someone who sounds like they're authoritative and have done their homework. And I think that's increasingly where a lot of the environmental movement is at. When we got in this game 20 years ago, we were the darlings of the press. We could do no wrong. We were tilting at windmills, and the press was always supporting us. For example, with Pollution Pro, we made some horrendous mistakes, didn't do our homework, made a lot of statements that were, frankly, totally unfactual and inaccurate, and the press supported us and didn't point that out at all, because the environment was new and it was a fairly undisciplined area. Things have changed. The press has become much more sophisticated, and they're just as eager now to clobber an environmentalist who's being inaccurate and off-base and unfair as they are a senior corporate executive or a cabinet minister who's being inaccurate, hasn't done his or her homework. So, and I think that's good. I think it's brought some professionalism and rigor into the environmental movement, which we need. But all of that having been said, there is still a diversity. There are groups that put a premium on individual action and what individuals can do, the recycling business, changes in personal lifestyle. I noticed a flyer from a group that's asking everybody on every Sunday to make a new change in their life. I think that's great. Then there are those, the Coalition on Acid Rain is an example, 2 paid hired lobbyists in Washington who travel around in very high circles, influencing legislation, believe me, for the better of the environment. My view is there are different strokes for different folks. You implement a strategy that suits you. If you like the shirt and tie conservation diplomacy approach, go get them. If you want to chain yourself to a tree, I would stop short of spiking trees. But if you want to chain yourself, because I think that can hurt people, I'm not sure we want to actually hurt people. That's a bit contradictory. But chain yourself to trees and participate in demonstrations and lay down in front of bulldozers, which I've certainly done. I was there when we stopped the Pickering Airport. I ripped a stake from the site on the day it died and got a picture of me holding the thing in the air with a bulldozer closing in. You know, you got to have different styles for different people. And I think what we need is more tolerance within the environmental movement to realize that we're all contributing in a different way from a different style. But I think there has been this drift out of necessity towards more professionalism, doing your homework, being able to produce a more credible case in the sense of established economic arguments for what we want.
Good morning. Here in British Columbia, you being a forester and all, one of the issues in forestry is that we're cutting around 100 million cubic meters of wood every year here in BC, and it's somewhere about almost double the sustainable yield. And those pictures you see over there of the managed forest are, in our opinion, the mangled forests. So also, I just wanted to speak, there's about a demonstration that's happening Tuesday throughout British Columbia at 12 o'clock at all the regional forest offices. We're hoping people can come out and express their concerns about the slash burning, about the herbicides, about the exported logs. But my question is, how do we best affect change in this area, which is one of our biggest problems in British Columbia?
In my view, the forestry profession, and I speak as one, is one of the most arrogant, insensitive, and intolerant professions that I know of. It's not that there aren't foresters who want to do the right thing, but there is this professional superiority that if you're not a forester, you're not qualified to comment on forestry matters. And unfortunately, the profession has persuaded the politicians that that's true as well, that you don't count because you're not a forester. Well, that person's talking about herbicides, but they don't really understand. This person, you know, and then we pull out the techno babble, all the technical stuff, cunits and silvicultural practices, and baffle you with all the technical stuff. And that's, you know this already, you're nodding your head, that's what you're up against. And I guess your question is, I think that as long as the forestry establishment has that view and that posture, it is inviting very dramatic, increasingly dramatic, and extreme protests and expression of disapproval from the public for what it's doing. And it deserves it. And I think that that's really all you can do. Unfortunately, the more people demonstrate and show, I think, as it were, rail and speak against the forestry establishment in so-called extreme ways, the more that confirms their view that these people really just don't know what they're talking about. So it's kind of a Mexican standoff with people lobbing grenades from a distance right now. I think that a lot of the change has to happen within the forestry community itself. The polls on how Canadians regard the forest are absolutely astounding. Roughly 3 times the number of people in Canada see our forests as something which is there for wildlife and to benefit the environment and to be enjoyed. 3 times the number of people see it in those terms as do those who see it as an industrial product, basically fiber on the hoof, if you want. And the forest industry and the forestry profession regards that as an education problem. We have to show the public that their view of the forest is off base and get more people understanding it as a resource and that it can be managed renewably and through integrated resource management and that sort of thing. So that what you've got is a propaganda war right now. I'm not answering your question, I'm restating it because I'm deeply involved in this. I'm trying to soften up people on the other side of the fence. I'm trying to say, look, there are some legitimate beefs out there, and I speak regularly in the lion's den, and I love it. I love going in and tearing strips off my professional brethren and sistren and trying to get them to, there's 50% of the faculty of forestry at the University of Toronto are women right now. So you're part of the problem too.
I just want to say one other issue. Coming from a pulp mill, I'm a pulp worker, and I just wanted to say that right now the pulp mills take about 1/3 of the fiber resource, and I think in a very few short years, in the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see that change completely, where we're going to become a pulp mill economy because the wood's going to be too small, and it's going to put a lot of people out of work because the proper forest practices of thinning and the rest of it that goes along with it aren't being done.
Well, I agree, and I think you may become a recycling economy at some point too. I hope you do. I think there's an issue here that you haven't mentioned, which is the role of protected areas. Which areas are not going to be managed and not be cut. And speaking of pulp, in Alberta, Manitoba, and Quebec right now, there are some very large-scale pulp proposals, the largest in the world. And where Wildlife Fund's position is not to come out against these proposals, but to say, we want on the table at the same time that these proposals are coming forward to exploit large areas of the landscape, we want to see what the proposals are to protect large areas of the landscape. And I think that's worth looking at, not just better forestry practices on that part of the landscape that's going to be managed by the forest industry, but how much of the landscape is going to be left alone and not managed by the forest industry.
Monty, we have about 5 minutes left and 3 people who want to speak, so let's try and be brief. I believe you were next. Just turn it off.
Your topic is saving the world, and a lot of people are asking, what can we do? I wonder how many people are prepared to take a major decrease in their standard of living in every aspect of what we do, doubling our grocery bills, having 1 car instead of 2, or maybe no car instead of 2. And in reading the Financial Post, I noticed that all of the companies who hand out their statistics always talk about profit increases. And I wonder if you have any strategies where we can communicate to companies as a corporate group and say we're willing to invest in companies that maybe have no growth, and rather than always having to pick companies for investments that have 17, 22, 27% profit, say we're willing to accept your statistics of a standard 5% profit without any growth every year, always trying to increase. And the statistics always seem to, zero growth doesn't mean zero profit. It means that you got the same profit this year as last year. That we would be willing as a corporate body to invest in companies that hold the environment, improving the environment and working without harming the environment as a major goal for the company. If they could somehow identify themselves, so we as professionals could say, fine, we'll buy stocks in that company. That's where we want to put our money.
That's part of your answer. I think there's a very standard and establishment route for this. You become a shareholder and you show up at the annual meeting and you say exactly what you've said. And you can take shares out in a company whose activities you support and show up and say so and say why. You can take shares out in a company whose activities you object to and show up at an annual meeting and say so. It's believe it or not, a form of corporate democracy which very few people take advantage of, and you only have to have 1 or 2 shares to show up and have your say. So that's a direct answer to your question. This business about how much are we supposed to lose in our standard of living bothers me, because first of all, Canadians have said, they've been asked very specific questions. Would you trade this off? Would you trade that off? Would you pay more on your utility bill? And they've said, yes, we will. We will pay. When it's going to cost more, we will pay. Just get out there and do it. We'll pay. It's not true that Canadians have said are not prepared to pay. So that's answer number 1. Answer number 2, I'd like to ask, in many cases, are you prepared to accept an increase in your standard of living and quality of life by doing more things for the environment?
Yes, I'm concerned or interested in the amount of money and resources taken from the earth that we spend on defense in Canada and in countries in the Western world. What do you think is the likelihood that a good part of this could be diverted to environmental issues saving ourselves from ourselves rather than some kind of perceived enemy.
I wish you hadn't asked this question because it's one of my pet peeves. I mean, I've forgotten the numbers. They're trillions. It's like thousands of factors more spent on defense than for the environment. It's totally out of whack. I thought Dave Barrett's suggestion that the Canadian military should be used to do something for the environment was a great one myself. I sort of wax irrational on this one. I'm a peacenik from way back. I really can't understand why we spend as much money as we do trying to figure out how to kill people rather than how to save the planet. I'm totally sympathetic to what you say. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources has done a study. If you want, I'll try to get it to you, on the opportunity cost. In other words, all of the good things we could do for the environment with just a portion of what's spent on defense. I guess you talk about screwed up values and priorities. You know, when you look at what's spent on defense versus what's spent on the environment, it's a very telling comment that maybe this shift in values either isn't happening as fast as I'm suggesting, or we haven't got the message through to people who are controlling those kinds of expenditures. I'm just totally sympathetic to the point you're making. One more.
I'd like to take this moment because we're looking for action plans and just ask most of the people are in the audience who are educators, how many schools here use recycled paper? I think that's a significant thing to ask because it's one little thing that we can do. And I'm a teacher on Salt Spring, and we have a staff which hasn't necessarily been supportive of too many things in the past, but this would be a project that would work for students in their schools, because when we asked how many people on the staff would support the idea of cutting back on paper, as we have increased so much in the last few years, and making a commitment, they all voted to do that. So I want to mention that there's a company in Vancouver, once we put in our order, which was saved from going bankrupt. Company is called Paper Choice, and unfortunately it gets its paper from the States. But Paper Choice, when we put in our order for 30,000 pieces of paper, which we got for $1 more than we usually pay per thousand, was unable to keep going. So I encourage people to phone Paper Choice. The number's on the wall over there by environmental educators, and do something for their environment. Especially students could do something like this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Good idea. We could also all bring our own coffee cups, couldn't we? And for tomorrow, because I didn't bring mine today either. I'm sure we could go on with Monte for quite a while, but we do have to give you a coffee break because the sessions start in a half an hour at 10:15, the workshop sessions, and I know you want to take those in. So thank you very much, and we'll see you later.